Globalization is a widely discussed topic. It is therefore not all that easy to explain such a complicated term in simple words. Let's start from the beginning with the background to globalization. Advances in technology, such as mobile phones, aeroplanes, telephones, and the internet, have made the growth of transport and communication networks possible. Amongst other things, this means that people and countries can exchange information and goods more quickly and in a less complicated way. This process is called globalization. Globalization comes from globe and means the worldwide coming together of countries and nations. Let's look at an example. Companies used to manufacture products in their home countries, just like the companies Profi TV and Supercolor, who produce televisions in country A. Their products are in direct competition with each other, but both companies pay the same salaries and production costs. They have the same customers, use similar suppliers, and sell televisions at similar prices. In short, the same conditions apply to both companies. So far, so good. Due to technical, cultural, and economic developments that have come about through globalization, other companies which manufacture products under different conditions can now offer their products in country A too. That's why a company from country B can sell televisions here at a lower price because they were produced for less. The local firms Supercolor and Profi TV have to react to withstand the competition. And so the world grows closer together, and there is an active exchange of goods between countries. More affordable products are available for more people. However, not only does an exchange of products and economic goods take place, but also of services, knowledge, cultural goods, and even languages. All of these individual elements are closely linked and influence each other. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Because of globalization and this intense exchange of goods, people and the environment often suffer. If a company decides to move production to an economically disadvantaged country, people in industrialized countries lose their jobs. At the same time, job opportunities open up to many locals in the economically disadvantaged country. Many people in these countries work for very little money in comparison to those in industrialized countries. Therefore, they often remain poor and more often than not do not have sufficient insurance, social insurance, or health insurance cover. A further disadvantage of globalization is ecological problems such as climate change. The use of aeroplanes, ships, and lorries to transport goods over international borders is constantly on the increase. This causes more carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere, which, in turn, is the main cause of global warming. Even national environmental standards are ignored. This is a further cost factor in the worldwide international site competition, which should be kept as low as possible to be attractive for a company. There are therefore many sides to globalization which affect almost all aspects of life, causing me to think that the chain of positive and negative effects will continue to grow further. What's important is to realize that globalization itself is neither good nor bad. It just depends how people deal with all the new possibilities in the future.
Good morning!
Good afternoon.
And good evening as well.
This is Karen R. Pacleta.
This is Jen Marie Zaldivia.
And Julius Bobo. Just kidding. And Julius Michael De Leon, your discussants for the International Trade Theory and Development Strategy.
Over the past several decades, the economies of the world have become increasingly linked through expanded international trade, portfolio investments, and direct foreign investment, especially on the part of the large multinational corporations. The video already showed us the general definition of globalization, Hence, to define globalization in its core economic meaning, globalization refers to the increased openness of economies to international trade, finance flows, and direct foreign investment. It may suggest exciting business opportunities, efficiency gains from trade, more rapid growth of knowledge and innovation, and the transfer of such knowledge to developing countries, facilitating faster growth, or the prospect of a world too interdependent to engage in war. On the other hand, it also raises troubling concerns that inequalities may be accentuated both across and within countries, that environmental degradation may be accelerated, that the international dominance of the richest countries may be expanded and locked in, and that some people and regions may be left further behind.
If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do. If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do. I could buy a home for the homeless and turn around their luck. And after ending homelessness in the USA, I'd still have 14 billion bucks. I could pay for cancer treatment for everyone on the earth. And if I funded every school in California, that would only be half of my worth. How much money is it? Well, maybe this will explain. If his wealth were in nickels, it would stack to the moon and then stack back down again. And then back up, and then back down, and then back up, and then back down, and then back up and down again. And then add another 10 more stacks. Hey! If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do. I'd make the city of Tallahassee into a town of millionaires. And when I'm done handing out those funds, I'll still be a billionaire. And for everyone in New York City, I could buy your subway rides. And if you looked in my wallet after 15 years, you'd see 4 billion left inside. How much money is it? Well, maybe this will explain. If his wealth were in singles and put on a scale, that's what 98,000 rhinos weigh.
And that's 3 times the rhinos that are left in the world.
Hey! If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do. I could pay a living wage to everyone I call my employee. Or failing that, I could probably find the time to let them pee. And I could earn more in an hour than most you make in your life. But I convinced myself it was through hard work, and you deserve every bit of your strife. How much money is it? Well, maybe this will explain. It takes 12 million years to earn that much if you make minimum wage,
Which is longer than people have existed on the earth.
Hey! If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do. If I had the money that Bezos has, think of all the things I could do.
To quote Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, global trade is like a 100-lane highway crisscrossing the world. If it is a free-for-all highway with no stoplights, speed limits, size restrictions, or even lane markers, its surface will be taken over by the giant trucks from the world's most powerful economies. In short, globalization makes it possible, at least in principle, for the less developed countries to effectively absorb the knowledge that is one of the foundations of wealth of developed countries.
Moving on to the next topic under Chapter 12, we have international trade, some key issues. In recent years, much of the attention to trade and development issues has been focused on understanding the spectacular export success of Taiwan, South Korea, and East Asian countries, which was followed by China. In the special circumstances of the oil-producing nations in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere, the sale of unrefined and refined petroleum products to countries throughout the world accounts for over 70% of their national incomes. Despite obvious benefits, specialization in oil production frequently has brought with it substantial, if sometimes hidden, economic costs, including both economic and political distortions. Many other developing countries must still depend on non-mineral primary product exports for a relatively large fraction of their foreign exchange earnings. This is particularly a serious problem in sub-Saharan Africa. This is an important issue because despite strength since 2002 and some rebounding after the 2008 crisis, the long-term trend for prices of primary goods is downward, as well as very volatile. Indeed, some developing countries have been receiving at least 2/5 of their export earnings from one or two agricultural or non-fuel mineral products. For a majority of developing nations, import demands exceeded their capacity to generate sufficient revenues from the sale of exports for much of the post-World War II period. This led to chronic deficits in their balance of payments position in relation to the rest of the world, whereas such deficits in the current account were compensated for on their balance of payments table by a surplus in the capital account. High reliance on oil and other fuel exports has also brought with it substantial, if often hidden, economic costs and political distortions. An outsized oil sector often acts as an enclave in the economy, benefiting relatively few citizens yet resulting in reduced exports from other sectors of the economy that might do more to benefit development in the long term. In addition to their export dependence, many developing countries rely generally to an even greater extent on the importation of raw materials, machinery, capital goods, intermediate producer goods, and consumer products to fuel their industrial expansion and satisfy the rising consumption aspirations of their people. By opening their economies and societies to global trade and commerce and by looking outward to the rest of the world, developing countries invite not only the international transfer of goods, services, and financial resources but also the developmental or anti-developmental influences of the transfer of production, technologies, consumption patterns, institutional and organizational arrangements, educational, health, and social systems, and the more general values, ideals, and lifestyles of the developed nations of the world. Although the overall figures for export volumes and values of developing countries are important indicators of patterns of trade for the group as a whole, we will see throughout this chapter that the prices, services, or commodities being exported by a country is as significant as the figures or dollar values of its exports. As with most development topics, there is high diversity among developing countries. Traditionally, however, as compared to developed countries, developing nations are dependent more on trade. The greater recorded share of developing country exports in GDP is probably due in part to the much higher relative prices of non-traded services in developed countries than in developing countries. Nevertheless, the point remains that developing countries are generally more dependent on trade in international economic relations because most trade is in merchandise for which price disparities are smaller across countries. Most statistical studies of world demand patterns for different commodity groups reveal that in the case of primary products, the income elasticity of demand is relatively low. Moreover, since the price elasticity of demand for primary commodities also tends to be quite low, any shifts in demand or supply curves can cause large and volatile price fluctuations. Together, these two elasticity phenomena contribute to what has come to be known as export earnings instability. As stated earlier, export prices are as important as the goods or commodities being exported since export price hugely affects the total earnings of the country. If export prices decline, a greater volume of exports will have to be sold merely to keep total earnings constant. Similarly, on the import side, total foreign exchange expended depends on both the quantity and the price of imports. This is the special term provided by the economist for the relationship or ratio between the price of a typical unit of export and the price of a typical unit of imports, which is represented through P sub X and P sub M, which refers to export and import price indexes, respectively. Remember that the commodity terms of trade are said to deteriorate for a country if P sub X over P sub M falls, that is, if export prices decline relative to import prices, even though both may rise. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis was named after the two famous development economists who first explored its implications in the 1950s. They argue that there was and would continue to be a secular decline in the terms of trade of primary commodity exporters due to a combination of low income and price elasticities of demand. This decline would result in an ongoing transfer of income from poor to rich countries that could be combated only by efforts to protect domestic manufacturing industries through a process that came to be known as import substitution. Another topic in this chapter is the so-called the traditional trade theory of international trade. A transaction is an exchange of two things. Something is given up in return for something else. One kind of transaction is called a barter transaction. This is a trading of goods directly for other goods in economies not fully monetized, which was applied in various countries, even the most remote villages of Africa. Basically, people trade because it is profitable to do so. Different people possess different abilities and resources and may want to consume goods in different proportions. Because it is virtually impossible for individuals or families to provide themselves with all the consumption requirements of even the simplest life, they usually find it profitable to engage in the activities for which they are best suited or have a comparative advantage in terms of their natural abilities or resource endowment. The answer is to be found in international differences in the structure of costs and prices. Some things are relatively cheaper to produce and can profitably be exported to other countries like Kenya. Other things can be produced in Kenya at a lower relative cost and are therefore imported into other countries in exchange for its manufacture. As compared to comparative advantage, which focuses on lowering opportunity cost to sell goods and services at prices lower than competitors, yielding greater profitability and stronger sales margins, absolute advantage refers to lowering production cost. It enables us to describe analytically the impact of economic growth on trade patterns and the impact of trade on the structure of national economies and on the differential returns or payments to various factors of production. The presented slide merely suggests that the factor endowment model assumes that certain products will always be relatively more capital intensive. Others like India, Egypt, or Colombia have little capital and much labor, and in general, developed countries are relatively capital abundant while most developing countries are labor abundant. The main conclusions of the neoclassical model of free trade are that all countries gain from trade and world output is increased. However, there are several others in addition to these two basic conclusions, which are first, complete specialization will not occur as in the classical comparative advantage model. Second, the equalization of domestic product price ratios with international free trade. Third, predicts that the economic return to owners of the abundant resources will rise in relation to owners of scarce resources as the abundant factor is more intensively used. In developing countries, this would generally mean a rise in the share of national income going to labor. Finally, trade is assumed to stimulate economic growth.
Thank you, Ms. Zaldivia. The conclusions of traditional international trade theory are derived from a number of explicit and implicit assumptions that in many ways are often contrary to the reality of a contemporary international economic relations. That is why we recognize that the real world is beset by national protectionism, international non-competitive pricing policies, and other market failures. Hence, the 6 basic assumptions of the traditional neoclassical trade model must be scrutinized. This initial assumption about the static nature of international exchange is central to the traditional theory of trade and finance. In reality, the world economy is characterized by rapid change, and factors of production are fixed neither in quantity nor in quality. This is especially true with respect to the resources that are most crucial to growth and development, such as physical capital, entrepreneurial abilities, scientific capacities, the ability to carry out technological research and development, and the upgrading of technical skills in the labor force. Relative factor endowments and comparative costs are not given but are in a state of constant change. North-South trade models focus especially on trade relations between rich and poor countries. It argues, for example, that initial higher endowments of capital in the industrialized North generate external economies in manufacturing output and higher profit rates. This, in combination with the rise of monopoly power, stimulates higher northern growth rates. As a result, the rapidly growing North develops a cumulative competitive advantage to the slower growing South. The assumption of full employment and traditional trade models violates the reality of unemployment and underemployment in developing nations. The underutilized human resources create the opportunity to expand productive capacity and GNI at little or no real cost by producing for export market products that are not demanded locally. One of the most obvious examples of the impact of developed country technological change on developing country export earnings is the development of synthetic substitutes for many traditional primary products. The argument that the worldwide availability of new technologies developed in the West has given many newly industrializing countries the opportunity to capitalize on Western research and development expenditures by first imitating the products developed abroad but not on the frontiers of technological research. Certain middle-income countries with sufficient human capital can follow the product cycle of international trade. However, the assumption of fixed worldwide consumer tastes and preferences dictating production patterns to market-responsive atomistic producers is unrealistic. The traditional theory of trade assumes that nations are readily able to adjust their economic structures to the changing dictates of world prices and markets. Reallocation of resources are extremely difficult to achieve in practice. This is especially true in developing nations where production structures are often rigid and factor movements are largely restricted. Here are the major limitations of the perfectly competitive assumptions. The first one is by assuming either fixed or diminishing returns to scale, the labor cost and factor endowment theories of trade neglect one of the most important phenomena in international economic relations. This is the pervasive and income-widening effect of increasing returns to scale and hence decreasing the cost of production. Economies of large-scale production lead to monopolistic and oligopolistic control of world supply conditions. It means that large individual corporations are able to manipulate world prices and supplies in their own private interests. The phenomenon of increasing returns and product differentiation, combined with the non-economic power of large multinational corporations, means that the first nations to industrialize are often able to take advantage of these economies of scale and differentiated products to perpetuate their dominant position in world markets. Second is the exclusion of risk and uncertainty in international trading arrangements. The coexistence of rich and poor regions, at least in theory, be counteracted and ameliorated by the intervention of the state. Cumulative processes for inequality within nation-states by which growth poles may expand rapidly while other regions stagnate can be modified by the government through legislation, taxes, transfer payments, subsidies, social services, regional development programs, and so forth. Governments are often partisan players whose activist interventions in this area of industrial policy are specifically designed to create a comparative advantage where none existed before, but where world demand is likely to rise in the future. Governments may also employ various instruments of commercial policy, such as tariffs, import quotas, and export subsidies, and can manipulate commodity prices and thus their trade position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Governments also serve to reinforce the unequal redistribution of resources and gains from trade resulting from differences in sizes and economic power. The terms of trade, or international commodity price ratios, adjust to equate the supply and demand for a country's exportable and importable products so that trade is always balanced. That is, the value of exports is always equal to the value of imports. In some enclave economies in developing countries, foreigners often pay very low rents for the rights to use land, bring in their own foreign capital and skilled labor, hire local unskilled workers at subsistence wages, and have a minimal effect on the rest of the economy, even though they may generate significant export revenues. Those in the lower income brackets may not benefit from these exports. The inter- and intra-industry trade that is being carried out may look like a trade between the rich and poor nations. But in reality, such trade only occurs between all the rich nations. To move on to the next topic, Mr. De Leon, take it away.
Traditional trade strategies and policy mechanisms for development. Export promotion versus import substitution.
In this part, I will explain to you briefly the trade strategies for development, namely export promotion, which is advocated by the trade optimists, and second one, which is the import substitution, which is advocated by the trade pessimists. So, in order to have context on the matter, let me introduce to you the two types of development policies in terms of perspective, which are the outward-looking policies and the inward-looking policies. The outward-looking policies are for the openness and accessibility in terms of trading on the free market, which then promotes competition. It corresponds to the export promotion mechanism. The inward-looking development policies, on the other hand, focus on the development of a country domestically on its own. It is done by imposing higher tariffs and lowering quotas for imports in order to protect the local workers, traders, and consumers. In short, when we say outward, being participative in the world market by reducing restrictions for trades. And when we say inward, prioritizing growth of a country on its own. Now, let's put this in the Philippines' current situation. If we take a look in the Philippines' current situation, it is observable that our President Bongbong Marcos, is looking to implement the inward-looking development policy or the import substitution mechanism. Why so? Because we can see that he is encouraging foreign investors to invest in local import substituting industries rather. And you might ask, how did I get to this inference? Simple. In order to contain food inflation, the Philippines had to lower its tariffs for rice imports from 40% in quota and 50% out quota to a single rate of 35%. That resulted in imported rice being cheaper than the locally produced ones. So to counter this, our President Bongbong Marcos must impose higher tariffs while also making sure that the domestic production of rice is sufficient to cater the demands of the Philippines by outsourcing capital. And that is how I made that inference. But the implementation of such policy or mechanism is not easy to do, as in order to protect the Philippines' domestic development, the imposition of higher tariffs and lowering the quotas for imports shall be done. But it cannot be done without proper assessment of the Philippines' current situation, specifically as we are currently reliant on imports, as the Philippines is considered to be the most food insecure country in the emerging Asia. In addition, in order to start manufacturing own goods locally such as food, bicycles, food, household appliances rather, transportation, it would require high capital, and so that would be inefficient considering the existing competition. In conclusion, in putting the Philippines in context, the import substitution mechanism will help the Philippines the most as it focuses on being dependent on its own domestic capability in terms of workforce, resources, and market structure. This would result into the producers, workers, and traders to be more competitive and productive at the same time in the domestic market. But such implementation of policy is hard, especially the transitioning phase considering the fact that the Philippines is currently reliant on imports and also the absence of capital domestically.
The industrialization strategy approach to export policy.
Since the mid-1980s, another important strand of thought has emerged concerning the relationship between trade and development. The industrialization strategy approach is outward-oriented and optimistic about export-led development, but still envisions an active role for the government in influencing the type and sequencing of exports as a country strives to produce more advanced products, adding higher value. It has long been recognized that there are market failures in original research and development, and these market failures form part of the explanation for why a government industrialization strategy centered on absorbing technology from abroad may improve efficiency. Of course, for small countries, one reason is to ensure a market of adequate size, but proponents argue that the full explanation goes well beyond this. The use of manufacturing experts of growing technological content as a yardstick of performance automatically emphasizes targets with very strong development benefits. These individuals found that exporting a mix of goods that are more typical for a country with higher per capita income predicts higher subsequent growth. He states that what seems to distinguish the East Asian development experiences is not the dominance of market forces, free enterprise and internal liberalization, but effective, highly interactive relationships between the public and private sectors, characterized by shared goals and commitments embodied in the development strategy and economic policy of the government. As Danny Roderick and others have pointed out, a government doesn't have to pick all industries correctly, only a sufficient number for the benefits of those successes to outweigh the costs of failure. The new research examines ways that firms respond to more open economies in the globalization process, and the implications of these responses for patterns of investment and potentially for structural transformation. One useful starting point may be another recent strand of development literature focusing on analysis of the firm and plant-level data from developing countries and regions.
South-South trade and economic integration.
South-South trade is largest in communications equipment, chemicals, electric, and other machinery and basic metals. One strong variant of such trade is that developing countries should go beyond greater trade with one another and move in the direction of economic integration. Economic integration occurs whenever a group of nations in the same region join together to form an economic union, which is a full integration of two or more economies into a single economic entity, or regional trading bloc B, which is an economic coalition among countries within a geographic region. In the terminology of integration literature, nations that levy common external tariffs while freeing internal trade are said to have formed a customs union. If external tariffs against outside countries differ among member nations while internal trade is free, the nations are said to have formed a free trade area. Finally, a common market possesses all the attributes of a customs union plus the free movement of labor and capital among the partner states. The traditional theory of customs unions and economic integration focuses on the static resource and production reallocation effects, but the deeper economic rationale for the gradual integration of less developed economies is a long-term dynamic one. Integration provides the opportunity for industries and for those that have to take advantage of it. In some cases, this is perceived as a defensive response to decreased access to export to other markets. Lastly, it can be seen as a mechanism to encourage a rational division of labor among a group of countries. Absence of integration leads to the second dynamic rationale of integration, which is coordinated industrial strategy. Trade creation is said to occur when common external barriers and internal free trade lead to a shift in production from high to low-cost member states. In contrast, trade diversion is said to occur when the erection of external tariff barriers causes production and consumption of one or more member states to shift from lower-cost non-member sources of supply to higher-cost member producers. Many European Union members use a single currency, the euro, requiring close monetary coordination and in effect creating the largest economic entity in the world. A number of trading blocs have emerged in Latin America. Common Market of the South, also known as Mercosur, which was described as Fractious Bloc, South American Bloc, and Regional Customs Union known as the Union of South American Nations. South African Development Community, East African Community, which aspires for full political and economic union, Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, which is a free trade area with 19 member nations, an economic community of West African states that primarily focus on monetary union. Anthony Venables argues that through extensions of traditional trade theory that within customs unions, countries with a comparative advantage between that of their partners and the rest of the world do better than countries with an extreme comparative advantage. Moreover, he argues that the availability of North-South agreements is at best unclear for many low-income countries. On the other hand, Paul Collier offers a balanced starting point when he argues that regional integration is a good idea but not behind high external barriers. Beyond this, although opportunities to benefit from solidarity across developing countries have improved in some ways, prospects remain uncertain. Leading developing countries have never had so much power in the councils of global economic policy making. On the other hand, over the past 2 decades, there has been steadily increasing inequalities among developing countries in rates of growth of incomes per capita. This also tends to widen disparities in their priorities and interests.
First, let's define the barriers for imports, specifically the tariff and non-tariff ones. So first, the tariff. Tariff serves as an additional cost for the acquirement of imported goods. So in effect, it should make the imported goods less desirable to buy than the domestic ones. Non-tariff barriers, as for example, the quotas, are set by the government to reduce the quantity of imported goods to be in the country. So it both protects the domestic industries, specifically the vulnerable producers, as it causes less competition from the imported goods. But here is when it becomes problematic. It is when the goods to be imported by the developed countries from the developing ones becomes less competitive due to these barriers. It stagnates the development of the developing countries / low-income countries, as they will not be able to keep up with the competition from the developed ones. And so, problem like this was partially resolved from the Uruguay round. To put it simply, tariff and non-tariff barriers for imports are good in terms of protecting the domestic industries of low-income or developing countries. But on the other side of the coin, it has detrimental effects for the low-income or developing countries also, as it makes its exports less competitive than the domestic products of the developed ones. At last, to further resolve this, the participation of developing countries in trade talks are crucial so that the tariffs for the exports of the developing countries will be reduced.
And that is all for this chapter. De Leon, Pacleta, and Zaldivia are now signing off. For our references, please refer to the following.